At the United Nations, world leaders gathered once again to confront the deepening climate crisis. Among the most anticipated speakers was French President Emmanuel Macron, who delivered a speech that balanced urgency with pragmatism. His remarks carried the weight of a leader aware of both the political and scientific challenges, while underscoring France's determination to remain at the forefront of global climate action. Macron began by addressing the room directly, noting the shared understanding of why so many heads of state, ministers, and diplomats had assembled. He reminded the audience that the struggle against climate change had been formally shaped nearly a decade earlier. Almost 10 years ago, the Paris Agreement set our common objectives underpinned by science, he said, stressing that those goals still serve as the benchmark against which nations must measure their progress. According to him, the visible consequences of climate change across every continent are now impossible to ignore. Turning to his own country's track record, Macron reaffirmed France's dedication to living within its environmental means. France, since 2017, has been complying with its carbon budget, and we're living up to our obligations. We're going to continue doing that. You can count on our economy. You can count on our country, he declared firmly. The statement was not only a reassurance, but also a call to credibility, positioning France as a model of accountability at a time when skepticism still surrounds global climate commitments. Macron looked ahead to the next major milestone, COP30 in Belém, Brazil, scheduled for 2025. With a nod to the leadership of President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and Brazilian negotiators, he voiced clear solidarity. Europeans will be there in Belém, living up to expectations, and France will be defending that meeting, he said, urging nations to approach the summit with seriousness and ambition. He then outlined France's strategy leading up to the summit, pledging that his country would submit its nationally determined contributions, NDCs, by the end of the year. These, he explained, would be underpinned by science and designed to bring together public and private investments. Macron endorsed interstate carbon credits as an essential mechanism to help industries survive the transition without backsliding into unsustainable practices. The French leader also reminded delegates of an agreement made in Dubai, the progressive phase-out of fossil fuels. With urgency, he insisted, this is absolutely vital, and that's why we need to accelerate our efforts moving away from carbon in particular. This, Macron argued, requires binding objectives, especially for methane emissions. Methane, a potent greenhouse gas, has already been targeted by the Global Methane Pledge, which now includes 150 countries. Macron's call was directed at those nations still on the sidelines. By joining, he stressed, they would take part in one of the fastest and most cost-effective ways to reduce emissions. As chair of the G7 next year, France will keep methane reduction front and centre. Macron insisted that leading economies cannot afford complacency and must set the pace for others to follow. Moving beyond emissions targets, Macron shifted to the equally urgent matter of biodiversity. He reminded delegates of the scientific evidence showing the intertwined nature of ecosystems and climate. We know, thanks to the work of the IPCC, that there are deep synergies between our fight to limit CO2 emissions and the fight for biodiversity. They're mutually reinforcing, he said. He highlighted oceans and primary forests as critical battlegrounds in the struggle. We need to forcefully fight to protect our oceans and our primary forests because these two fights are part and parcel of our efforts to protect biodiversity, Macron stated. These ecosystems, he argued, function as the planet's most valuable carbon sinks, and preserving them is non-negotiable. The French leader pointed to the Amazon as a prime example, noting that France is itself part of the region through French Guiana. He announced plans to propose new financing mechanisms specifically designed to protect the Amazon, while cautioning that the world cannot ignore other vulnerable regions such as Southeast Asia, Papua New Guinea and Africa. Macron argued that too much focus has been placed on reforestation, while insufficient effort has gone into safeguarding existing forests. Countries rich in forest resources, he warned, risk economic disadvantages by preserving them without international support. Macron celebrated the progress made at the recent conference in Nice, co-led by France and Costa Rica, which successfully pushed the ratification threshold of the High Seas Treaty beyond 60%. Yet he insisted more work must follow. The treaty, known as the BBNG, is designed to protect international waters, and Macron urged swift implementation. He linked this effort to the 30 by 30 Montreal biodiversity objective, protecting 30% of terrestrial and marine ecosystems by 2030. I'd also like to invite you in so much as possible to join the deep sea mining moratorium. That's absolutely essential if we are to preserve biodiversity, he said, adding that without strong protections, ecological destruction in the name of short-term profit could undo decades of progress. On the financial front, Macron noted that the European Union has pledged 28 billion euros in climate finance, a quarter of the global total. France itself, working through its development agency, has mobilised 7 billion euros annually for climate action, tripling its commitment over the last decade. Still, Macron admitted, far more remains to be done. He introduced what he called the Pact for People and Prosperity, or the 4Ps, a coalition of 73 states that are developing innovative solutions, including resilience in aviation, biodiversity credits, and new financing frameworks. No country should have to choose between combating poverty and protecting the planet. Every country should be able to choose their own path, Macron insisted, underscoring the justice dimension of climate finance. According to him, development banks like the World Bank and the IMF must reform their policies to take climate vulnerability into account when allocating funds. Vulnerable nations, many of which contribute least to emissions but suffer most from climate change, must receive priority support. Mobilising private finance, Macron stressed, is equally critical to ensuring the transition succeeds. In his closing remarks, Macron pushed back against voices that continue to question climate science. Sometimes we hear narratives to the effect that climate issues, biodiversity, are up for debate. Some people say the science is not clear-cut, but I do believe the science is clear, he said. He pledged support for open and free science, emphasising that policy decisions must rest firmly on credible research. The president concluded by reminding the Assembly of the importance of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, whose scientists will meet again later this year to continue advancing the global agenda. Recognised scientists, eminent scientists, harbour no doubts. We defend open free science so that we can underpin our decisions with that science, Macron declared, thanking the international community for its collective efforts. Macron's address at the United Nations was not a sweeping appeal to lofty ideals, but a focused, pragmatic roadmap. He revisited the Paris Agreement, affirmed France's credibility, and highlighted Bellem's importance as the next milestone. He called for accelerated transitions away from fossil fuels, binding methane objectives, and stronger safeguards for forests and oceans. He tied climate finance to justice, urging reforms in the global financial system, and closed by defending the role of science as the foundation for all decisions. For Macron, the message was clear. The fight against climate change is inseparable from biodiversity protection, financial justice, and scientific integrity. The world, he insisted, cannot afford hesitation. The commitments France is putting forward, whether through NDCS, financial pledges, or biodiversity protections, are designed not just for France, but for a collective future. At a time when the world faces political divides and economic pressures, Macron's speech sought to remind the international community of a simple truth. The climate crisis demands unity, urgency, and trust in science.